Hello everyone and welcome to the Gunpla Network. I'm the Spicer, and today's review of the 2016 high-grade Cosmic Era Strike Freedom Gundam comes to you courtesy of those fine folks over at Canadian Gundam. Canadian Gundam is your one-stop shop for all things plamo and Gunpla here in North America. With a vast catalog, flat-rate shipping to the US and Canada, and a private warehouse option, they've got you covered for any situation. When you're checking out that vast catalog and placing your next order, don't forget to use the promo code Gunpla Network to save yourself 10% off. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with the high-grade Cosmic Era Strike Freedom. In terms of its actual movability and accessories, it's taking a lot of the things I liked from the Ale Strike and the Freedom and combining them into one unit, which is very fitting. Unfortunately, it does take some of the negatives from both of those suits too, but we'll take a look at that more in a moment. In terms of the overall sculpt, I feel like it's kind of in the same boat. It fixes the large rail cannon situation I had with the Freedom, but it still doesn't hit kind of the same way that the Ale Strike does, and I'm not exactly sure as to why. Proportionally, everything makes sense. The sculpt doesn't feel too soft or too harsh in certain areas, but it also just doesn't have the same kind of presence that the Ale Strike does. We'll take a look at them side by side a little bit later on in this review, but overall, I think this sculpt is still better than the Freedom, and the proportions work a little bit better. I don't know if maybe it's the torso being slightly elongated, if it is, or the rail cannons being smaller, or the backpack kind of being more central. There's a lot of things that it could be. It's hard to say exactly which, as it's more of a personal preference, but overall, I do think that this is probably, in terms of the visuals and the sculpt, a little bit better than the Freedom Gundam. But that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below if you prefer the Freedom or the Ale Strike to this. Now, in the pure aesthetic portion of this, the actual look of the suit itself, it's actually really nice. Not even comparing it to anything else, there's a lot of really cool visual things on this kit, and the main body is entirely stickerless. You do have some stickers for the accessories and the wings, but generally they're not too bad. Even the side skirts, the rail cannons, actually are full plastic. There's no stickers there, which is kind of amazing. The stickers were kind of the only main thing on the body of the Freedom. They got any stickers, and the Ale Strike didn't have any stickers on the body, so this is actually coming in very well in that instance. The gold stickers on the backpack are not perfect, but they fit well enough, and you don't really have too many issues with them peeling up, but they're really the only stickers in there. That's kind of impressive. As far as the head goes, I don't have any stickers in there. I just use the two clear silver foil stickers that go behind the eyes. So you're not looking at a sticker, you're looking at light shined off a sticker through some blue plastic. And then you see the stickers on the beam rifles. Those are probably going to be the most concerning, but overall they're not all that terrible. The gold through all of the inner frame is actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be. With a high grade and having gold on it, you're a little worried it's going to be a little cheesy looking or a little fake looking. And while it's not the best looking gold out there, it is actually quite solid. It's still a little plasticky, and I would say if you really want this to pop, if it's like going to be a mainstay in your collection, maybe consider painting the frame up a little bit. But generally, if you just want to do this straight out of box kind of like this, it's going to look good, especially if you're not usually painting things. So kind of take that as you will. Take it with a grain of salt. Use your preference on that, but I think the inner frame by itself is just fine. Now as we take the backpack off and look at the upper portion of the body, the head, the chest, and the arms, we get a little bit better look at not only the eyes, but the inner frame and the cannon and the elbows. Once again, very solid looking here. I think the idea of having the option for just clear silver foils behind the eyes is actually kind of cool. It does give you a deactivated look, and you can achieve that very easily by just tilting the head down. But if you hit some light right in there in the right angle, it'll shine and look really cool. So you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. I would say it's definitely not as impressive looking as stickers sometimes, but it is a cool option. I'm glad they included it here. I hope we see it with more high grades in the future. One thing I will note that is maybe not a visual issue, the little red piece on the front of the torso there likes to fall off for no reason. There's no reason this piece individually should be its own individual piece, but it is. So I'm going to take a little super glue and put it in there because it doesn't hinder any articulation or get in the way of anything. And while I think it may be to help facilitate holding the long rifle, it's kind of more of a nuisance than anything else because it falls off all of the time. Now as we move down to the legs, you'll get to see one of the coolest gimmicks of this kit that I didn't think was actually going to happen, with the weird side skirt movement. This is a thing that happens on the master grade, and I assume in the animation, although I can't exactly remember it, but you can store the beam rifles on the side skirts after moving the side skirts back. Now this doesn't get too much in the way of the backpack, but it does occasionally bump into it and limits some articulation, so kind of keep that in mind. But it is a really cool gimmick and I'm glad it's here. It doesn't really throw off the aesthetic of the suit either, which is pretty cool. Well, the beam rifles are a little chunkier, they don't screw with the proportions too much, and they don't make the suit look all wonky. It is kind of cool to have the rail guns in the back, but I think the beam sabers stick out just a little bit too far. Of course, without the backpack, that's not a big issue, but everyone's going to want to have the backpack on this. So that's just kind of a cool feature with a couple of minor nitpicks. We get to see more of the gold inner frame on the knees, and this is one thing I will point out, that while it's not a huge issue and it's to be expected for a high grade, the master grade has the little vents on the front of the leg, on either side of the leg, kind of on the calf, painted gold. Understandably, that wouldn't happen here. It's a high grade. I don't even expect them to give us stickers for that, and they don't, which is totally fine. But if you do want to get a more impressive look out of the legs, that's something you can do, especially if you're painting the entire inner frame already. Outside of that, the legs are pretty standard fare. You have little vents that pop out on the back, but nothing else really to write home about. Now, the backpack. The backpack's actually not the worst part of this kit. It's not great, but it's not awful. The one thing is, visually speaking, it's actually really solid. The red bits are all plastic. All of the color except for the gold is plastic, and that's very impressive, especially after coming off the Freedom, where you have those weird red pinstripes on the cannons and a bunch of moving parts that really loosen up over time, mostly in the wings. This doesn't really have that issue. There have been a few instances where I have to kind of tighten them up, but they never feel super loose, so you can just really do that with a press. It's not a big deal. I like the different play off of the navy, the light blue, the red, the gold, even in sticker form. You do get a little bit of marbling on the navy, but it's really not all that bad. It's not super noticeable, so kind of take that as you will. If you notice a little bit more, because it will vary kit to kit, kind of consider looking at that, but honestly, it's not that distracting, and I really didn't notice too much until I sat down to look at this review. Now, once you actually get it on, not actually a terrible fit. It's not too back heavy, with the big chunky beam cannon being gone out of the backpack. Everything is consolidated and moved forward a little bit, so the center of gravity is actually a little bit closer to the mobile suit, meaning you can spread the wings out all crazy, at least to the sides, without any major issues. Now, don't try to do this to the back, because it will, of course, make this much more back heavy and tip it over, but you can actually get some pretty impressive on the ground poses, which is more than I can say for the most part for the Freedom. Overall, you are still a little limited because some of the poses aren't as impressive, and one of the main kind of issues I have with the, I wouldn't say posability necessarily, but the gimmicks of this kit is one of the really big cool selling points to the Strike Freedom is the Dragoon system, and unless you have either a very specialized stand or a lot of extra stands to hold the Dragoon bits, if you will, you're not going to be able to use that function. They're still very impressive as wings, but it's just a cool feature that you don't really get to use in plastic unless, like I said, you have the specific accessories for it. And there's so many that you would need a lot of little extra stands, or like I said, a specialty stand designed to hold fin funnels or anything kind of that nature. Now, they don't have like 3mm peg holes or anything in them. They're just slid on little tracks, basically. But they are just about wide enough that most of your bases, to like where the base of a peg is on a base, it'll fit around that. So you're still going to be able to probably use most of your existing bases for that if you want, but kind of, mileage may vary on that. Now, if we get to a little bit more of a realistic looking pose, or maybe a more traditional Gundam pose, we have the Strike Freedom bringing the beam shield across the front of the body, and it is at an angle. Let's kind of keep that in mind, and it's not overly big, which I actually kind of appreciate, because it still almost bumps into the shoulder, but it's actually a pretty decent effect. It's not all sparkly or anything, but it is pretty reflective, and when light hits it, it looks pretty good. It's not my favorite accessory, of course, but as far as a shield goes, it is a big jump from the Freedom having just a holding hand. The peg itself is very sturdy, but that is in a sense, its own issue. The red peg, when the shield is not in there, is in there very firm, and you pretty much have to take the base plate off to push from the other side to get the red thing to pop out. Totally fine, not a huge deal, it's very easy to do, it's just an extra step that you wouldn't necessarily think you would need to take. But the good news is the red bit stays in there, so you don't have to worry about losing it. So far, the only thing I've almost lost on this kit is the red portion on the chest, so take that as you will. Everything fits in there well. If you do decide to get this and build this, I would probably recommend super gluing that stupid chest piece, because it doesn't need to move, unless you're using the long rifle, and even still, I think that doesn't really help that much. Now, in terms of actually getting to some of the flying poses and some of the non-beam rifle skirt issue thingies, we have a pretty cool flying pose here with the wings spread out to different varying degrees, and these are all still pretty much collapsed. I guess not the inner wing, I guess the outer wing is what you would call it, actually kind of fins out a little bit, and we'll see it in a couple of other poses, but you can get a really impressive spread on it. Kind of pulling a mid-air Riccardo Fellini one arm out with the wings spread out. Pretty cool looking. You can get a lot of cool dynamic looking poses up on a stand with the wings. And I honestly say, well, this is a lot more stable than the Freedom on the ground, and you can get some pretty good poses. This is still, much like the Freedom and the AL Strike, going to be a kit you want on a stand. The wings, of course, kind of make that pretty evident. But if you really want this to be a big shiny part of your display, that's what you're going to want to do. Now, of course, if you add some effect parts, you're going to get a little bit extra pizzazz there, if you will. It has a really good sense of motion with your flying, and the torso joint is strong enough, just barely, to hold the wings in a variety of different angles, so you can get a kind of thrusting forward pose like this. Not too hard. But you will have to kind of work with the wings, because they still do pull back the chest quite a bit. But overall, very nice looking. You have a good degree of articulation to pull things off like this, and, well, of course, the stand helps a lot in this regard. You do have quite a few options depending on whether you kind of want more of a regular flying, kind of somewhat static looking pose, or like a rushing forward pose like this. Now, once we actually get some of the weaponry out, the beam sabers look great, so they're pretty much the exact same ones you got on the Freedom, and you can have some pretty cool ground poses. This is actually one of my favorite poses, and much like the Freedom, the beam sabers kind of come in for the win. Well, the beam rifles look cool in their own right. This just looks so much cooler, so much more aggressive, so much more dynamic, and once you get it kind of on the ground like this, you have a lot of availability, especially with the wing serving as kind of an extra touch point. There are not a lot of suits that I can actually get, for the most part, an actual flat-footed kneeling pose without having to fudge the details a little bit, but this is probably the closest of any of the suits we've messed with so far, at least in this little series of reviews. Very cool looking. Probably, like I said, my favorite pose of this individual suit. But beam sabers are cool. Effect parts are cool. You know, it's kind of hard to beat that. Now, once we get them back up in the air with the beam sabers, you can attach them. I'm not a huge fan of this pose, but it is an iconic pose for the Freedom and the Strike Freedom. So you can do that. Doesn't hold it super great, but you can kind of wiggle it around and get just enough friction for it to hold it okay. If you do like this type of a pose, I would say putting some stickers around kind of the center part, or adding a little bit of super glue to kind of help the friction. Don't super glue them together unless that's what you want to do, but just a little bit on the outsides to help give just a little bit more friction in the hand, because they're rounded, and of course the hand is a square hole. So you can do it. It's not the easiest, or I don't want to say the easiest, it's not the most stable pose, but you can do it. Now, as we go to kind of a semi-full burst here, bring the railguns forward. They work just fine, and they're not super out of the way, or in the way. They are maybe a little bit less visually impressive than the Freedoms, but they also fit the scale and the proportions quite a bit better. So I would say these are probably my favorite of the two anyway. You also have the chest, or the, I guess, stomach beam cannon, so you can use that as well. Of course, there's no real big thing you can do posing wise with that, but if you kind of bring the arms in, it does make it look a little bit more like he's kind of pushing that portion out to fire it. With the torso joint, you could probably push it in just a little bit as well, and have a pretty convincing effect. Now, if we want to add the beam rifles to that, you can absolutely do so. They're held in the hand pretty well. They just slot in. You don't have a peg or anything, and you don't have to take the back of the hand off, so that's actually pretty appreciated. I forgot that for a lot of this review and kind of feel dumb that I didn't just think to pull the gun out, but no, I had to disassemble the hand, which isn't a huge thing, but it is just one of those things that, oh, I've dropped the back plate of the hand again on my floor. How long is it going to take me to find it? So, you know, it's just nice when little accessories kind of help with that, kind of like the beam sabers. But overall, it's a very good look. You don't have either one of them looking wonky or too big or too small. They blend with the rail cannons quite well. And as you can see here, the wings are splayed out, so you do get a little bit bigger sense, a bigger presence, if you will, of this suit. So if you have it on your shelf like this, it is going to take up more space, not only in terms of actual space, but more of your attention when you're looking at it. Now, this is the fun bit with the long rifle, and as cool as this is probably like one of the worst iterations of it. The Master Grade doesn't do this great either. This is just not like a super plausible practical effect. It's a cool concept, and I like the way it looks in animation, but it just is not really super possible to hold in this. When the beam rifles are individually there, they're about the perfect weight for the hands. And it's not really that they drag the hands down in this configuration, which, I mean, they do because it's heavy, but it also messes, like, it's too heavy, too front-ended, too heavy in the front for the peg that the handle is on, so it also swings down, so it just doesn't hold very well. Kind of keep that in mind. You can pull off poses with this. It's going to be a little bit more work, and if you want kind of an outstretched pose, you're probably going to have to do quite a bit of work that may involve some glue or some sticky tack or something to add a little bit of friction and help counterbalance the weight, because it is quite front heavy, because that entire front gun is just not held up by anything in terms of the suit helping balance it. Now into the comparisons, and I'll try to make this quick because I realize I'm running a little long here. But as you have it up against the high-grade Cosmic Era Infinite Justice, its partner in crime, if you will, they look really good. I would say the Strike Freedom feels a little bit bigger, but not by a whole lot. And if you already have the Infinite Justice, this is actually a pretty good companion to it. I would say the Infinite Justice in most of its construction is a little bit better, but overall they're pretty on par, and honestly, they look quite good next to each other. Now, of course, if you have the Master Grade Strike Freedom, you can put it next to that, and well, it's not quite as impressive. It is still a cool "don't talk to me or my son" moment if you want to throw some memes out there. But, I mean, they look good. You do get to see a little bit more what I was talking about with the gold on the Master Grade and some inspiration if you wanted to paint the high grade. But if you decide, like I said, the out-of-box presentation for the high grade is just fine. So, kind of take that as you will. It's really a personal preference. Now, kind of the big comparisons for this series of reviews, at least. Here it is up against the Freedom, and as you can kind of see, like I said, proportionally, it just looks a little bit closer and makes more sense in and of itself than it does on the Freedom. Like I said, the proportions on the Freedom just feel wonky in a lot of places, and this corrects at least most of them, because I don't have that same issue here. But that could just be me and kind of seeing things for whatever reason. And then we have the Ale Strike, and as I said, the Ale Strike still has its own kind of presence that neither the Freedom or the Strike Freedom have hit on, but the Strike Freedom in and of its own right kind of has a little bit of presence. I'm not going to say as much as the Ale Strike, but it does have a little bit more of a consistency in how it's presented in a lot of different ways. And overall, I mean, I think visually speaking and from a posing standpoint, they're both very good. Overall, as I said, I'm very pleased. I think proportionally, visually speaking, everything pretty much is where it needs to be. Well, the Dragoon system doesn't really get any play, which is unfortunate. It is something to kind of be expected here, and I wouldn't expect Bandai to throw in a bunch of like little mini stands to hold up the Dragoons. The accessories, for the most part, work. While the long rifle is a little bit of a disappointment, I wasn't really holding out a lot of hope for it. As I said, the Master Grade's not much better. Overall, if you are a fan of the Strike, the Freedom, or the Strike Freedom, this is definitely a must-have. If you're a fan of a solid high grade, once again, it's a must-have. If you're not a Seed fan, but you kind of want to try out one of their designs and this catches your eye, I would say try it. But outside of that, if you're not a Seed fan, this is something you can sleep on pretty safely. Let me know what you think about this kit in particular down in the comments below, and keep your eye out for my ultimate judging video for these 3 different kits. I've been the Spicer here for the Gunpla Network. Please stay safe and keep on building.